So I'd like to begin by taking a moment to reflect on the more than 32,000 lives that have been taken and the 1.8 million starving Palestinians due to Israel's bombardment and forced famine of Palestinians in Gaza. Israeli forces are currently still occupying Al-Shifa Hospital as we speak, and we're hearing horrendous reports of humiliation and devastation from witnesses who fled the massacres. Israel has also continued to bomb Rafah, the safe zone that Israel forcefully evacuated nearly 80% of Gaza's population to, even the very day following the UN Security Council passing a resolution for a ceasefire. This is an ongoing, insurmountable loss and suffering that deeply affects each of us, especially as Americans, with billions of our tax dollars used to transfer bombs, artillery shells, and weapons to Israeli forces that have themselves documented killing and torturing Palestinian civilians. And as Americans, we bear a responsibility in Israel's acts of plausible genocide. And that's what brings us here today. The title of today's briefing is The Biden Administration's Response to the Humanitarian Crisis in Gaza. Some of the topics we'll be covering are the US response to the humanitarian crisis, including airdrops and a floating pier, the NSM-20, and Israeli assurances that deny the obstruction of aid, and Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, and Israel's failure to comply with the UN Security Council vote for a ceasefire. And there's no better group of experts to discuss these issues than our three panelists here today. And so I'll quickly do an introduction of their bios. That way we can jump into conversation and let it flow naturally. So I'll begin with Jesse Marks. Jesse Marks is the senior advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International. He is a policy practitioner and humanitarian researcher with extensive experience in humanitarian response, foreign policy, and multilateral perspectives on aid. He has spent over 5 years in the United States, Middle East, Europe, and Asia researching, advocating, and reporting on humanitarian crises, particularly on improving access to victims of conflicts in hard-to-reach areas and working with multiple stakeholders to prevent refugee refuelment. Sara Yager was named in the top 100 most influential people in armed violence reduction by Action on Armed Violence and received the Truman National Security Project Award for extraordinary impact. Sara is the Washington director at Human Rights Watch and leads the organization's engagement with the United States government on global human rights issues with a particular focus on national security and foreign policy. And finally, Laila El-Haddad is a Palestinian writer, media consultant, and leading voice on Gaza. She is the co-author of The Gaza Kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey, and a contributor to major news outlets and newspapers. She covered major events such as the Israeli disengagement of 2005 and the Palestinian elections of 2006 during her time as a reporter for Al Jazeera English in Gaza. Her groundbreaking appearance on CNN's Parts Unknown with Anthony Bourdain in 2013 showcased Gaza in a humane light. A graduate of Duke University and the Harvard Kennedy School with focus on political science, public policy, and history, El-Haddad makes her home in Clarksville, Maryland with her husband and their 4 children. And I'd also like to note for our attendees today that Laila was also a plaintiff in the CCR case that we mentioned in our earlier briefing. So we'll jump right into conversation. I'll begin by asking each of our panelists a question, asking them to kindly keep their responses between 5 to 7 minutes so that we have time for other questions. Thank you so much for joining us, to all the panelists and all the attendees with us today. So on Monday, the State Department announced that they've received credible and reliable assurances that Israel has not violated US law, basically stating that Israel has not obstructed aid from entering Gaza. And Senator Sanders and other members of Congress have stated that these assurances are not credible. Human rights organizations and NGOs have also found that these assurances are not credible, and the UN has documented Israeli obstruction of aid. Even Israeli ministers themselves have openly blocked aid trucks, and Israeli forces have opened fire at Palestinians collecting aid, which has resulted in several aid massacres, killing hundreds of starving Palestinians that were in line waiting to collect food. Senator Sanders' statement this week said, to pretend that Israel is not violating international law or interfering with US humanitarian aid is absurd on its face. The State Department's position makes a mockery of US law and assurances provided to Congress, end quote. So I pose this question to Jesse based on your research. You've argued that Israeli authorities do in fact actively block aid from entering Gaza. And as your colleague Jeremy just wrote today in Just Security, famine is already underway. So can you help us unpack this obstruction of aid and how it connects to the violations of US law?
Certainly, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. I mean, I think at a top line, the kind of the first principal piece here is the conduct of Israel's military response has wrought nothing but disproportionate death and suffering on civilians in Gaza. And I think first and foremost, this is the primary driver of the famine conditions, right? The sheer destruction of critical infrastructure, housing, water access, shelter, hospitals across the board. And even as we've seen evidence of famine become clearer and clearer, we continue to see Israeli authorities obstructing and undermining access and humanitarian aid delivery from neighboring Jordan and Egypt. And specifically, we're talking about a few forms of impediments here. Like Refugees International was in the region earlier this month or earlier a couple of months back, and have continued following conversations with a range of stakeholders. And we found through a number of these conversations, the routine and arbitrary denial of legitimate humanitarian goods entering Gaza. So there's a long list of rejected items which are currently sitting in a warehouse in Egypt, which should be in the hands of doctors and medical staffs and hospitals and health clinics healing injured patients, right? We've seen, simple things such as tent poles and sleeping bags, up to, more complex things such as renewable energy, batteries, solar panels, refrigerators, these types of things that are critical to any form of like scaling of a humanitarian aid response. In one specific case, we had an NGO tell us that they stopped trying to send tents into Gaza and instead sent plastic tarping and duct tape with the direction to folks who would be receiving it to dig through rubble to find metal poles to serve as kind of the primary stilts. We also found evidence of a highly complicated Israeli inspection and approval process that lacked any form of clear, consistent instructions. If you read a report we put out recently, you'll actually see a visual chart of how many hoops a single truck has to jump through just to get into Gaza. And the current system is not positioned to effectively scale. Rather, the entire lack of process has forced a major backlog of critical food and medical supplies from entering Gaza at a time where many inside are indeed starving. Even just as of this week, there are 1,300 trucks in Arish in northern Sinai waiting to enter Gaza, and almost 1,000 of those, so let's take that in, almost 1,000 of those are critical food supplies. And we're only seeing those numbers enter in the tens, and if we're lucky, and 100 to 115 a day, which is more arriving every day. The backlog just keeps getting longer and longer. We also found frequent denials of humanitarian movements within Gaza and direct attacks against deconflicted humanitarian locations and personnel. And this is something that has been raised by virtually every NGO, civil society organization that is operating in Gaza or is connected in terms of the response to the conflict. It's not a simple question of just getting large volumes of aid across the border. It's also having the safety, security, and I think keyword here, permissions, to ensure that aid is being delivered to communities displaced that are particularly in areas beyond the range of current aid actors in UN, particularly in the north. As of now, so no clear, consistent, residual, and predictable security and access has been guaranteed. And previous attempts, as we have seen from news and really tragic reporting, have in some cases led to hundreds being killed. Overall, we're not seeing any meaningful changes to the current trajectory, despite Israeli assurances to the U.S. that it is complying with humanitarian law in Gaza. There's a mountain of evidence furnished by Refugees International, Human Rights Watch, other organizations who have been doing really incredible work to identify and document the horrible reality on the ground right now. And it's deeply frustrating and sad to see the recent State Department determination that Israel is in compliance, right? We appreciate many of the champions on the Hill who have come out and against that, who were there, in Arish and have visited the region and have engaged with all the actors, including the Israelis, and still came to the same determination that there is a clear blockage. And the Biden administration's response so far, airdrops and maritime corridors, are ultimately half measures, which do not go far enough to actually meet the worsening needs inside. There are no substitute for more land borders and expanded capacities. We saw that reinforced today with the new ICJ additional provisional measures which were laid out, which called for more border crossings and expanded capacities at those border crossings, not just airdrops, not just maritime corridors. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Really appreciate you providing that overview. And also, I have shared that report, the Refugee International report that you mentioned, in the chat. And we'll also be sharing resources in our Friday newsletter, our Palestine Policy Roundup, where we'll have these resources as well. So for our attendees, I'd like you to, take note of that, and rest assured that we'll be sending you these resources as well. Now, I'd like to provide a snapshot of this moment in time. Around 80 members of Congress have called for a mutual ceasefire, and hundreds of artists and celebrities have also made public statements, including several who wore ceasefire pins during the Oscars earlier this month. And just yesterday, or as of yesterday, 2 officials from the State Department have resigned in protest of the Biden administration's complicity and participation in crimes against humanity. Anel Shalin was a foreign affairs officer in the Department of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, DRL. And like many government employees, she joined the administration in hopes of advancing human rights, only to find that she was in fact doing the opposite. And I want to quote her op-ed that was just published in CNN yesterday, where she said, "Across the federal government, employees like me have tried for months to influence policy, both internally and, when that failed, publicly. My colleagues and I watched in horror as the administration delivered thousands of precision-guided munitions, bombs, and small arms and other lethal aid to Israel, and authorized thousands more, even bypassing Congress to do so. Where we are appalled by the administration's flagrant disregard for American laws that prohibit the US from providing assistance to foreign militaries that engage in gross human rights violations or that restrict the delivery of humanitarian aid." End quote. Now, it seems kind of absurd when you think about it, that considering the US is shipping weapons to Israel that are used to target Palestinian civilians while sending food to the very same people in the form of airdrops and even a floating pier. And we know that US weapons are being used in the indiscriminate killing of civilians, according to investigations by Amnesty International and several reported journalists. So while Israel is obstructing aid from entering Gaza, the US State Department decided to take these really significant measures to deliver aid, sending drones to airdrop aid and building an entire floating pier just to circumvent Israel's obstruction. And my question is, how does that work? While US weapons are being used in these crimes against humanity, as Anel pointed to, the US seems to draw the line at starvation. So where exactly is the administration drawing the line and deciding what's considered a violation of US law? And this question is for Sara.
Sure, that's it's a really pertinent question. So I just want to say thank you to Jesse for everything that he laid out. I would like to align myself with his comments. Let me take a step back and just say, so this NSM thing that we were all talking about, I want to be clear on what this is, because I think it's really important, and it shows what the administration has been doing, which it shows the confusion. It actually doesn't make anything clear. It shows the confusion. So NSM 20 is the National Security Memo 20, which was created with Senator Van Hollen and the White House. And the point of it, which seemed like a very good one, was to say that there are 9 countries that receive US security assistance, cooperation, military aid, arms transfers. And what they're going to do is be requested to submit written assurances that they are using that US assistance and support in line with international law. Now, Israel submitted its assurance last week, and the administration has 45 days to look at that assurance and say yes or no. You either are violating international law, you have violated international law in 2023, we believe your assurance that you won't anymore, or we don't. Human Rights Watch and Oxfam came together to pull all of our evidence and information that we had about how the government of Israel was violating international law and US law in two different ways. And we submitted that to the State Department just as Israel was submitting its assurance. So we did that in two ways. One, Oxfam as a humanitarian organization said all the things that Jesse said. They're blocking aid. Here's how they're blocking aid. This goes against US law. Under US law, a government is not allowed to block US funded aid unless it wants to get all of its support cut off, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that we have found, Human Rights Watch has found, that Israel has indiscriminately killed civilians, disproportionately killed civilians, used white phosphorus, which is a US weapon, in a way that violates international law. So we put all of our evidence forward, and together we submitted this. Now, this week, the Biden administration appears to have said, and I think that they're a little fuzzy on this, and they're trying to be fuzzy on this, that they believe Israel's assurances that they are using US support according to international law. This is an extremely devastating position because all of the evidence that we have points to violations. And so the US is undermining its own laws, just as Israel is undermining international law. So this is very problematic. And what I'm looking for, I think, at this point is for Congress to step in. And we've been seeing a shift in Congress. So originally, not many people would speak out. Senator Sanders, bless his heart, always speaks out. Terrific. We've now been seeing other senators, other representatives speaking out and saying, actually, the legislation that we created in Congress to protect international law and to protect our own American values, those are being undermined in this way. So we're seeing more and more come out, but we really need to see a strong push now to suspend arms to Israel because of this. And if not suspend arms, at least put forward this leverage that the United States has, put it on the table. They have not, we continue to hear US officials, very well-meaning, very well-intentioned, I believe them. They are calling on Israel to allow humanitarian aid and to protect civilians. Secretary Austin deeply believes this. Secretary Blinken deeply believes this. President Biden deeply believes these things. But you can't just ask the Israeli government to do this. They are just shrugging. They're not doing it. So you have to put something else on the table. And so far, US weapons have not been put on the table as leverage to get the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, to course correct, though that is a horrible thing to say at this point when so many people are dead, and to do the things that the United States is asking them to do. I think I have entirely avoided the question that you actually asked me in order to just give this spiel about what's happening in US policy. So please come back to me if I need to be more specific on what you actually asked me.
Thank you. That overview of the NSM-20 is incredibly helpful. And then we can also circle back to that in a minute. First, I want to go to Laila. So Laila, you're a Palestinian author and policy analyst, and you also write extensively about food. You've appeared on CNN's Parts Unknown with Anthony Bourdain in Palestine, correct? So, this is really the issue we're talking about here right now. And as we know, just this week, 13 Palestinians drowned while attempting to collect food from airdrops that descended into the Mediterranean Sea, which was a horrific thing to witness if you have not yet seen it. I have personally witnessed Palestinians in Gaza saying that they have nothing to eat but grass or animal feed, or somewhat edible plants from trees. And I wonder, how long can they survive without an intervention? And with the change in climate and seasons, will they even have access to these plants that they're relying on to survive right now in this moment?
Thank you so much for that introduction and for all of the other panelists' comments. And I too am going to actually, take a moment to actually rewind before I answer that question, and then I'll get to it. Just to remind folks of the context here, like how we got to this point, because I think it's very easy for the, uninformed observer to conclude that somehow suddenly there's a famine upon us, or almost upon us, an imminent famine, or that Gaza is just always the place where there is sort of destitution and poverty and hunger. But I just want to couch this in sort of the historical context as well, which is Israel's history of specifically targeting and destroying and controlling Gaza's foodways and food systems. And I think that's critical to understand, dating back, of course, to the early 90s when it began to impose restrictions, not that they weren't there before, on the movement of people and goods in and out of Gaza, which of course intensified after the disengagement in 2005 and then the elections in 2006. When we had, of course, the infamous comments by then senior policy advisor to Ariel Sharon, Dov Weisglass, describing the objectives of the blockade at the time, siege and then blockade, as the Gaza diet. The idea being, he said, is that we want to put Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. And this was, of course, backed up by a WikiLeaks cable that in which the Israelis were telling the Americans that the idea was to keep Gaza, quote, on the brink of collapse, right? And revealed a caloric formula that they had developed and were enforcing to allow just exactly the number of calories that they calculated were needed for each person to survive and avert a so-called humanitarian disaster, which of course we're way beyond that now. But beyond this, the idea was to always target the productive sector, prevent Palestinians from ever being able to be self-sufficient, grow their own food, control their foodways. And this is significant, of course, and leads directly into what you asked and the situation that we're in today, of course, which many months ago, Gallant clearly stated that he, quote, there would be no food. They would prevent the entry of food and water and fuel and so on. And I think that's clear when we talk about, of course, things like intent to commit genocide and so on, or the deliberate starvation. Everyone else talked about the obstruction and the blocking of food aid, so I don't need to touch on that. And this in conjunction with the Netanyahu statements about making the objective here being to make Gaza unlivable, all, of course, gives us the context we need to understand how we got to where we are today. I also wanted to read just a quote from an ERA report that found, similar to what I was saying, that Israeli, quote, ground forces have systematically decimated food production systems and prevented Gazans from harvesting and making their own food. This is according to the FAO. And that Israel has blocked access to farmland and sea and razed 28% of Gaza's cropland, over 70 to 80% of the fishing fleet, undamaged 488 agricultural wells, and about a quarter of Gaza's greenhouses. Livestock are starving and unable to provide a source of food, while Israel's restrictions on fuel reduce the residents' ability to cook for themselves. So that's, again, important to understand the systematic targeting of the foodways as a deliberate policy and tool in this genocide against the Palestinian people. To your question, no, it won't last long. It's not, of course, something sustainable. It's something, thank God, that Palestinians have this knowledge of. At least elders, I've spoken to a lot of younger people that had no idea how to prepare these foods, but learned from their grandparents and so on. It's a seasonal thing, of course. You're referring specifically to foraged weeds like mallow and sorrel, wild sorrel. The season for that is over. I know my cousin told me, who was in Gaza City until she was forcibly removed with her family a few days ago, that they were eating mallow for a couple of days a week, and that it was no longer available. It was actually being collected and sold, even though this was a wild foraged weed. Specifically in Gaza City, it would be much more difficult to find than in the north. So those kinds of wild edibles, their season is pretty much ending or has ended now, leaving very little, especially in the harsher summers that are, coming upon us for people to find to eat in the wild. let alone, of course, to be able to grow for themselves because of all the other constraints that I mentioned.
Thank you so much, Laila, for providing that very important context of the dozens of years of blockade and siege on Gaza. Now I want to return to Jesse, and Jesse mentioned the Refugees International report from March 7th that includes several recommendations to different groups: the warring parties, the government of Israel, the United States federal government, members of Congress, the government of Egypt, and the United Nations. And I'm curious about the specific part of the report that states that the departments of state and defense should actively canvass input from the humanitarian community active in Gaza when preparing their 90-day NSM 20 report to Congress. Can you unpack that a bit for us and tell us, this actually came up in a briefing, in a State Department briefing today, I believe. And I'm wondering what or who is the humanitarian community in reference? Which organizations are they? And what would it mean for the Department of State and the Department of Defense to canvass their input?
Thank you. Also, Laila, thank you for that. I think that's incredible context. Before I jump in the question, I just want to flag as well. When we were interviewing folks inside, one of the things that we heard consistently from folks was a specific targeting of food infrastructure and food systems, from bakeries to the largest milling plants in Gaza, to I think it was the Nusayrat bakery was one of the larger cases. So I think and the specific impacts that has had on the psyche of folks when it comes to just trauma, not just trauma of conflict, but trauma related to access to food and the targeting of food systems, I think is incredible, and I think further reinforces kind of the extent to which this is a man-made famine, an entirely preventable one, but sadly one that has been engineered for conflict purposes and for driving the suffering of civilians. On the specific recommendation, it's actually funny you say that, because since writing the report, I think the humanitarian community at large, so operational NGOs who are working on the ground, rights NGOs, advocacy NGOs, there's been a powerful coalition across the board, have come together in pretty powerful ways to jointly convey that Israel is actively blocking aid deliveries. And I would specifically direct your attention to a statement that was led by the International Rescue Committee over the weekend, which was signed by a large range of NGOs. And if I can just briefly read, I think 3 points from that, which very much so get to the point of what you were saying when it comes to the type of input they need to be canvassing. They said it very clearly. One, the humanitarian response in Gaza, including US-funded humanitarian assistance, has been consistently and arbitrarily denied, restricted, and impeded by Israeli authorities. Two, bureaucratic constraints are preventing the humanitarian scale-up on top of the conduct of the conflict. These constraints include the continued closure of vital border crossings, including crossings in northern Gaza, rejection of aid items for entry based on arbitrary, opaque, and shifting justifications, including definitions of dual-use items, lengthy delays and unpredictable processes for the inspection of trucks, and denial of movement requests within Gaza. And lastly, in addition, there have been repeated attacks on aid workers, convoys, distributions, and humanitarian sites, including those submitted to the Israeli authorities as part of a humanitarian notification and deconfliction process. I don't think it can be said any more plainly. And I think this gets to a broader point, which I think Sara very, poignantly alluded to, is that, the NSM process is not a silver bullet. The NSM process is not the only system by which this kind of reporting can be done. And in fact, it's a very new process on top of a much broader litany of policies and laws that already exist, which have already been violated and continually are violated day to day. Right. So the Departments of State and DoD are technically not required to wait the remainder of 45 days to get to that 90-day congressional report they're required on NSM 20. They can and arguably must act now. I mean, given the mountains of evidence that is publicly and privately provided to them by NGOs, by groups on the ground, by doctors who have gone in regarding military conduct, attacks on civilian infrastructure, everything I just laid out above. I think further to that 45 days that they have left in this period to get to the reporting requirements is plenty of time for Israel to expand its operations in Rafah. And I think that's something that they have promised time and time and time again to do. And though there have been efforts to, divert that specific outcome, the Biden administration, I think rightfully so, has been very forward-leaning and making sure that that operation does not go forward. I personally am deeply fearful of what comes next in the next few months, in terms of both suffering of Palestinians, but also casualty deaths, secondary mortality and starvation and forced displacement, if we do see that move forward. So I think that timeline, right, creates a large amount of space, both for the famine to worsen, but also to see an escalation, both in civilian casualties related to the war, but also just given the number of people who are starving right now and ongoing rates of both rising child mortality and mortality linked to starvation. Personally, if the famine determination was not a, to pardon Biden's term, come to Jesus moment, then I'm not necessarily confident that the Rafah operation or that any form of Rafah operation would also be one. It really comes down to how many people need to die before the White House moves from half measures to meaningful intervention to respond to Gaza in one end, but I think also to create the leverage, which they very much so have, which Sarah, I think, rightfully pointed out, to create the leverage to actually force behavior change in the near term to ensure that more people, to end the conflict-related deaths and to be able to surge the food, and I think key here, medical services needed to address the acute malnutrition, moderate and I think increasingly severe acute malnutrition, which is rampant in the north, but is growing and increasingly in the south.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for providing that context. That's really helpful and really truly absurd, given that there's so much documentation that you've provided and Refugees International have provided on this topic. That the fact that assurances were still accepted by the U.S. State Department. Now, I want to turn us to back to Sara Yager, and I promised we'd circle back to this when you mentioned the NSM-20 and how that came to be with Senator Chris Van Hollen. Now, I'm wondering, why does the administration focus so much attention on the NSM-20 and these so-called credible and reliable assurances? Isn't there already a U.S. law that would enforce a halt in arms transfers to Israel, given the obstruction of aid that's been documented?
Why, yes, there is. In fact, there are several. So yeah, I mean, they've been clear. The NSM-20 is not new policy. It's not new laws. The laws are already on the books. And that's, again, why I'm looking at Congress, because they've already legislated this. It has been in existence for a very long time that security partners are supposed to use U.S. weapons and funding in a certain way, meaning in accordance with international human rights and humanitarian law. You have things like the Leahy laws, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, where the U.S. cut off assistance consistently to units, specific units and individuals within countries who have abused human rights and international law. Israel has been an exception to most of these laws and policies since its founding, for various reasons. And one of the goals, I think, of NSM-20 was to get at this, was to say, in 2023, let's look back at the past year and figure out if these 9 countries, including Iraq and Kenya and Ukraine and others, if they actually are abiding by international law. I think the news that we got, that we never thought that the policy on Israel was necessarily going to change, and we had heard that early on. But we did think that there would be a lot more assessment, attention, investigation into the violations that we put forward, that everyone can see on social media, the things that the ICJ is looking at. Like there's a lot of information out there. And so for the administration to come out fairly quickly after Israel submitted that assurance and say, yeah, that's credible, we believe them, I think was really devastating. And it's unclear to me why. I mean, it's now that I'm being self-reflective, like in this moment in a live webinar, it could be that civil society put too much attention on the NSM. Like as soon as we heard that there was this process, we thought, this is a way to get attention to all of the things that we've been seeing. We put out press releases and all this stuff all the time, but maybe they're not paying attention to that. Maybe they've been very busy and they don't look at the hrw.org website. Here's our way of getting all of this information into them. I don't know if it was even considered. I hope that it was. let me just end on that. Since the bombing campaign began, I think on October 10th, whatever it was, some days around there, it is the responsibility of the administration to be assessing the conduct of its partners, including Israel in that moment. So this assessment now, great, but it's an add-on. They were supposed to be assessing all of this over time for the past 5 months. And what they have continued to say publicly is that they are not assessing. We're not going to play judge and jury. We're not going to do Monday morning quarterbacking, which is a bad sports analogy that doesn't even make sense. But we are not going to investigate what our partner is doing. We are simply going to unconditionally support them. So that already is a violation of US laws and policies.
Thank you so much. Yes, it is very interesting that we have focused so much of our attention on this when this was already US law. And that's just a question that's kind of been repeating in my mind. So thank you for clarifying that. Laila, I want to ask you, given the recent news actually that we just heard about an hour ago on the ICJ ruling, and on Monday, the UN Security Council passed a resolution voting in favor of a ceasefire, and the US abstained, and the resolution passed. Can you explain what made this vote different? Why did the US block the first several attempts at a ceasefire vote? And also, I want to ask, why does Israel continue to disregard the UN Security Council resolution? They've promised to continue attacking Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, until Hamas no longer exists. So I know this is several questions altogether, but I'm wondering, is that realistic? Is there anything that can be done to stop the bombardment of Gaza? So, kind of two parts to this question. The UN Security Council vote with the US abstaining, why are they, what made this vote different, and why is it reasonable, or is it for Israel to continue attacking Gaza until Hamas no longer exists? What can we do, right? I mean, this is the question. What can we do to stop this?
Pray. Sorry, I'm trying my best to be serious and not sarcastic here, but maybe I'll start with your question about why Israel continues to disregard UN resolutions. And I'll just say because they can. I mean, because they have the full backing of the United States, diplomatically, financially, militarily, because these resolutions, there's not an enforcement mechanism, because there's a history of impunity. I mean, I could go on, but according to the Biden administration, sorry, I just have to laugh. They say, of course, they find every legal loophole and say that the resolution is technically non-binding. And I don't want to get into the whole legalese of why they believe that's the case, which is, of course, factually incorrect. It seems like any resolution that is dealing with Israel specifically is either going to be vetoed or be non-binding or whatever. There's always going to be this exception, right? But certainly the Security Council had no problem enforcing Resolution 1441 when it came to attacking Iraq. So, I mean, that's in summary as to why they, I also just want to say I don't really hold much weight at this point. I'm just very pessimistic and cynical in the international system, in international law, in the United Nations, in these resolutions. I mean, they've proven again and again what a colossal failure and double standard they are. When it comes specifically to this resolution, it really even wasn't saying much. I think people sort of collectively, just gasped for a second and were relieved because they felt like, oh, finally, these, international systems are paying attention. But really, they was just calling for a temporary ceasefire. for a few weeks and a pause. And again, the fact that I just want to go back to context and to what the fact that now we're making this about strictly about, you know, how much food is allowed in, and making it a humanitarian plea for Gaza, which of course we, you know, we certainly need, but it's no longer about what really matters here, about ending the pre-existing siege on Gaza, about, you know, ending the occupation, about giving Palestinians their freedoms, and so on and so forth. So it was a very wimpy resolution to start with, which is partly why the US said that it abstained. It didn't even, of course, you know, agree to it, because it sort of agreed with the language, but had all these technicalities why it wouldn't approve it, and so on. So I just really, long story short, I think it's all sort of besides the point. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to exercise any legal tools at our disposal and challenge systems. We need to, and this kind of goes into answering the latter part of your question, is what can we do? I mean, everything in our power, you know, we challenge those legal systems using the mechanisms in place. But if you were to ask me, what really has more impact and effect is challenging the systems from outside, by putting pressure, by disrupting, you know, business as usual. You know, and that is what has proven to, I mean, I think the latest Gallup poll now for the first time showed that the majority of Americans disapprove now, of Israel's war and so on. And of course, no, it's not a realistic goal to say, people have said that from day one, to whatever it is that you'd ask me to eradicate Hamas and so on. Anybody that is familiar with the history of the organization and the way they operate, and can tell you that, right? Could have told you that from day one. And of course, that's just kind of a red herring to start with, because if you look specifically, of course, at and analyze the targets and the data and so on, that, you know, beyond the statements themselves that Israeli leaders have made, and this is again starting very early on in the war, not even now. It's very clear that the intention, and again, this is from Netanyahu himself, is to make Gaza unlivable, not to eradicate Hamas, right? To hit, you know, both symbolic targets like cultural centers and institutions, centers of life like the universities, people themselves like professors and medics, and journalists covering the stories of food systems, as we talked about earlier. That is really, to me, the target and the intention of this war, to eradicate anything that sustains life in Gaza and to make Gaza unlivable, not to eradicate Hamas. And I think we're going to look back at this. This is the sad reality one day soon, and say, you know, how did this happen? What could have been done to prevent it? And so on. Oh, it turns out this was really the objective, you know, and people have been saying this since day one, and we continue to say their objective is to genocide the Palestinians population, to genocide Gaza, to make Gaza unlivable, to just make it no longer a thing. And everything aligns with that goal, whether it's defunding UNRWA, whether it's to make the refugee issue disappear, you know, and on and on. I guess I didn't really answer your question, but.
Thank you so much for that. That definitely does answer the question. I think you addressed it with saying that their goal is different than what they've announced, but they have said they have stated their goal in other ways, and that is to starve Palestinians, and they have showed it through actions, right? By forcefully evacuating most of Gaza's population to Rafah, and then bombing them there, where it was promised to be a safe zone. Now, I do have more questions, but we have a question from an attendee. Laila, you mentioned the Iraq War. I don't know if this question was posed to anyone in specific, so I'll pose it to the panelists. The question is, I'm curious in what ways putting outside pressure and shutting down business as usual is proving effective. I want to believe that this will work, but there are indicators that are there any indicators that the outside pressure is going beyond changing general opinion to changing policy? Most Americans were also opposed to the Iraq War, and it didn't stop a 20-year war, unfortunately. Does anyone want to take the question?
Yeah, I mean, oh, Laila, go ahead.
No, go. I'm sure we all have things to say. Go ahead. You can talk.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the the largest community I think that Biden needs to worry about, which is the Muslim American community. But I am certainly seeing quite a lot of young people, in particular across the country, be very upset about what they're seeing. I don't think that any Americans are deep in the weeds on what we are talking about, but certainly they know that the US is the biggest supporter of Israel. I think there's also that balancing of, I don't want to say balancing, this is a very difficult thing, but what are Israelis actually supposed to do about their security? What about Hamas? What about the hostages? And I don't see a lot of discussion about what the alternative solutions should and could be. And I think that is something that we really need to have a discussion about, not only in our community, but Americans should be really focused on that as well, because we have a presidential election coming up. And what are the kinds of things that you want to see from your leaders? So I will pass it over to Laila with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to feel really disappointed and jaded, and certainly I have ups and downs, and of course I'm deeply invested in this. My family lives in Gaza. I mean, it's my tax dollars that are literally paying to subject them to this genocide. So there's days when I wake up and it feels dark. I mean, I just feel like that no matter what we're doing, as you said, no matter what pressure we're putting, no matter what legal mechanisms we're trying to utilize, like nothing seems to work. But I just keep saying we have to believe, we have to cling to that hope, because the alternative is just too horrible, that we just throw up our hands and say, well, it doesn't matter, and just total apathy. I mean, that's not in my value system. It feels like, we're just making a dent. But again, the way I think about it is you have to think about the long game here. And I think that's, being studied and written about, and what impact will this have vis-a-vis, public. You mentioned in the question public opinion. That's actually a huge thing, because public opinion and cultural shifts are what ultimately change policy, not the other way around, right? So I do want to believe that this will lead to a huge change. We may not be seeing it now. We may see the outcome of that in several years. And again, I derive my mandate, as well as my hope, from both my family and other friends and people in Gaza right now. They're the ones that are bearing the brunt of this, and we owe it to them, I think, to do everything in our power to speak out against this, and to put an end to it, even though it feels hopeless. We have no other choice.
If I could also just briefly add in on that point, I think there's one challenge to outside pressure. I think first and foremost is there's no independent international media allowed into Gaza. And the existing kind of journalism and reporting structure inside of Gaza has been, for lack of better terms, killed. The number of journalists who've been targeted, I think all of that reduces significantly the outflowing of information that we would traditionally see in other conflicts where, international media had a much larger presence. I think the second challenge, though, that poses is how dangerous it is then to connect to what is being produced locally, and just the information warfare that is persisting in the international community around the validity of what comes out of Gaza. And I think that those two things are linked, right? If you don't have an independent journalism, kind of robust reporting mechanism and flow of information coming out of Gaza, right, then the information environment on the outside can be shaped pretty easily by whichever institutions or organizations are kind of governing the flow of information. So news media can take briefings from the IDF or COGAT, and then that's going to be one powerful narrative, whereas NGOs and INGOs are going to struggle to maintain that same level even of just local perspective, because it's going to be hard to have anyone on the ground doing the reporting. So I just reinforce, I think that is critical moving forward to create that outside pressure. But I agree with both my colleagues here that there has been movement in the US. I think we need to see more of that. I think particularly the point of famine is a very powerful one that is present in the memories of many folks in Congress. People who remember the famine in Somalia and in Ethiopia, who have responded to that, right? That invokes specific images in their head and in their memory. Those images are not coming out of Gaza right now. The photography, the traditional structure that would be there to do that is not there. Thus, I think as both of them noted that like the average person in the US doesn't have that much information on what's happening, but finding ways to portray that story is critical. And I think the way that we do that is through telling the stories of Palestinians on the ground who are suffering. I mean, when we were in the region and we were interviewing a number of Palestinians, with about 10 to 12 hours of interview material, folks from forced displacement to, starvation to medicine to overcrowded hospitals, that honestly was probably some of the most moving and just gut-wrenching of what's actually happening. And that kind of narrative that generates that pressure is really hard to push into the current public narrative. And I think finding ways to do that, right? Finding ways to get those stories in front of congressmen, right? For Palestinian families who have families back in Gaza, right? Going to their elected officials and saying, this is what my family are experiencing, right? There's a number of Palestinians who left Gaza, who made it to Egypt, who had family members, right? Who were not necessarily able to go from Egypt to the US due to limited pathways, but who got out, right, and have family members in the US whose experiences, can be communicated effectively. So I think the key way is like taking that type of messaging, that kind of narrative, and really pushing it in to policy circles. But particularly one of the most effective ways I think that we haven't seen as much publicly is, those families going to their elected congressmen and saying, this is exactly what my family is doing. And me as a US citizen whose family is stuck there, do not want my taxpayer dollars and do not want you representing my taxpayer dollars funding weapons that are falling on my family. Like that kind of narrative and being able to paint that picture is critical.
If I could just quickly add to that, I mean, I want to give an example of how necessary that is, but also the limits. Because we have been doing that. I can speak, at least to my own community. I'm a Maryland resident, and there's a large group that was actively engaging with Senator Van Hollen early on, trying to get him to call for a ceasefire from day one, right? Knowing his track record and history and involvement and connection to Gaza. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't even say the word, right? We met him in private, functions. It took him weeks to agree to meet with us in person, but we did it. We 3-4 different groups of us sharing these stories, as you said, pictures, eyewitness testimony. And finally, in one of the last meetings that we had with him in late December, it was a virtual meeting. Someone said to him, we kept asking, like, why won't you call for a ceasefire? When will you call, etc. And then someone said to him, he said, I can't, etc. But however, what I'm going to do is make these amendments to make sure that the weapons aren't, sent. And someone said to him, how, what assurances can you give us that Biden won't just bypass that? And he said, no, he won't do that. Well, as we all know, 4 hours later, he in fact did that for the second time. And the group decided it was time to take out different strategy. And for the next 2 weeks, they showed up at his house with drums and with all sorts of things, sent him hundreds of birthday messages saying, too bad children in Gaza can't celebrate their birthdays. And exactly 2 weeks later, he called for a ceasefire. Now, I'm not saying that works all the time, but I'm just kind of demonstrating, to answer the person's question, the importance of utilizing both of those tactics together at the same time, and why sometimes, and I am a believer, you have to share those testimonies. You have to meet with your, at least to be able to say that you did, you know what I mean? You have to be able to give them those reports and accounts, because they're getting bombarded with other stuff. But also you have to disrupt when you're not getting results that you need. So they kind of go hand in hand.
Thank you all so much for giving a really robust answer to that really important question. And it seems that the outside pressure is definitely working, and the administration seems to be, pushing off to Congress. Congress is putting the pressure on the administration, and it's kind of going back and forth. But we're seeing as the people hold the power and the pressure to enforce humanitarian law. it is within the people's power to enforce that and to shift policy. So I'm grateful to see this question and the support from many people in the community and many constituents of these members of Congress. Now, this kind of makes me want to ask the question, and I'll give 1 minute to each panelist, or we can say a minute and a half for each panelist. It brings us to this question kind of smoothly. I wonder personally to know each of your personal opinions on what we're witnessing in the public sphere. Will the US continue to support Israel unconditionally, or have we reached that point, or are we reaching that point in history where international pressure and pressure from US constituents is going to impact US ties to Israel?
Well, we're all thinking about the right thing to say, like what we want to believe versus what's actually.
I mean,
mean-
I can't. Oh,
Go ahead.
Laila, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to take another moment to think.
Oh no, go, just say what you want to say.
So as I'm consistently told by the lawyers at my organization, I do not have a personal opinion. So I will say, though, as you know, working here in Washington and seeing all of that, this is one of the most. I have been working on armed conflicts for a very long time. This is one of the most intense, even just here in Washington. I am not in Gaza. I am not in Israel. I'm not part of the Middle East community, but even here in Washington is the most intense conflict I have ever worked on. And I think we are going to see a very big shift. I don't know. I don't think it's going to come from this administration. I don't even think it's going to necessarily come from my generation. I do think that it is going to come, and probably not in the next administration. I do think it's going to come from the young people of the United States. And I actually very much look forward to seeing that. I hope that they will immerse themselves in the history of all of this. I hope that they will understand the facts, the history, and then all of the stories, the ones that we're talking about. And I hope that they will embrace international law in a way that we are seeing it currently being undermined. I know that many of them want to just throw up their hands and eschew the whole thing. I think, you know, if we had a lot more respect for international law, we would not be seeing this happening to the people of Gaza right now. So anyway, my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, she basically said what I was going to say. So I agree with exactly that. I think that the time for that kind of, you know, if you had this federal judge saying unprompted that he urges the administration to question their, you know, unflagging support is what he called it, for Israel and its military siege of Gaza, and this is a federal Bush-appointed judge, then you'd have to think and believe that, yes, the time for that kind of unconditional support has come to an end, or and we will soon, I like to believe, see a shift and a change. It may not happen now, it may not happen in the next couple of years, but I think that we are seeing a monumental change right now.
Thank you.
I'll probably take a slightly different approach in that, having worked on the Middle East a long time, I think the thing that we tend to forget is the power of memory. Memory is linked to what people see, it's linked to the stimuli, it's linked to the amount of information moving in and out. Right, when we think back to other famines, when we think back to the Iraq War, even, you know, in my career, having grown up and spent a lot of my time on Syria, right, you know, seeing what's happening right now reminds me of what was happening in Fu and Kafraya in Syria, where people were boiling grass, right? So much of this is going to be linked to memory. There is a large number of people inside of the US government who know, see, and understand what is happening. I hope that institutional memory remains. So I was working in the federal government during the Afghanistan withdrawal. That left a major scar on civil servants. I hope this leaves a similar scar to show what happens when good policies or perceived folks who would, when there's an intention or a desire to create a specific policy that goes bad, whether that was intended to or not, to show the level of damage and human cost that can come with bad decision making and bad policy making, right? We all know that on Iraq. I hope that memory is scarred into civil servants across the US government and activists and researchers and journalists and academics to know what actually is happening inside of Gaza, because I don't think we're still at the precipice of the worst. And I think the closer that we move toward larger deaths as a result of famine, not even just war casualties, we are going to see more and more what happens when there is a missed opportunity, or there's a failure in an aid strategy, or the disjointed approach to solve a humanitarian crisis runs up against the desire to provide unconditional military support, right? These types of trade-offs will result in tens of thousands more dying. And I think that itself is going to be the thing that's going to be sticking in people's minds. And it's sad. And to me, it's detrimental to the US image, I think, to our ethos in terms of how we look at humanitarian crises, that it's going to take another, Biden even said it, his red line, to the point of like 30,000 more dead in his MSNBC interview, right? It shouldn't have to take another 30,000 dead, but based on the trajectory that we're seeing things going, it could. And I think that is sad, is shameful, and fundamentally needs to be branded into the minds of every policymaker about what happens when policy and decision making goes south.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Thank you, Laila. Thank you, Sara. And thank you to all of our attendees. I think that was a wonderful way to end this briefing, and a great way to segue into our next briefing, which will be in the coming weeks, on the question everyone has been asking us, which is, what comes the day after? So stay tuned for that briefing. And many thanks again to our speakers. Please share your feedback as you exit this call by answering the 2-question survey. It's very important to us. And we have a weekly roundup of Palestine updates that we share with the Hill staff every Friday. To join that list, please email me, and I'll place my email here in the chat. And for timely updates on unfolding devastation in Gaza, follow IMEU's social accounts by clicking the link in the chat. And if you'd like to schedule a meeting with us to share more information and policy analyses with either you or your boss or an organization, please also email me at nusayba@imeu.org. And I've put my link in the chat, my email in the chat. And as promised, I will share all the links and resources in the YouTube description of the recording of this briefing, which will be shared in our policy roundup on Friday. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.